New this morning, former President Trump denouncing the removal of the towering statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Richmond yesterday, which stood as the biggest Confederate statue in the nation. In addition to referring to the Confederate general as a, quote, unifying force, he also said if we only had Robert E. Lee to command our troops in Afghanistan, that disaster would have ended in a complete and total victory many years ago. What an embarrassment we are suffering because we don't have the genius of a Robert E. Lee. Joining us now is CNN political commentator and former special assistant to President George W. Bush, Scott Jennings. Scott, I have a lot of feelings about this, but before I get into any of that, let me just ask you, when you read the statement from the former president, which, by the way, included a lot more than just that, about the good generalship of Robert E. Lee, but conveniently left out the fact that he chose to fight against the United States and for the Confederacy in the defense of slavery. Aside from that, what did you make of the statement?
Well, there were a lot of things going on in here. The first part about the statue piece, I mean, this is an ongoing debate. We've had some panels on this show about statue removals. You know, I have no use for these Confederate statues myself. Some people think it's representative of our history. There's a lot of polling out there that indicates Trump's position on the statue part is actually not an invalid political position. And so that debate rages. I don't like the Confederate statues. I tend to prefer statues of American heroes, people like George Washington. I think where the statue people went off the rails is when they started removing statues of non-Confederates. But, you know, that's a topic for another day. The rest of the statement was, I mean, the idea of a time-traveling Robert E. Lee going to Afghanistan is enough for a book. I like a sort of a historical, sci-fi thriller of some kind. What I think Donald Trump is doing, I mean, we know he's not a historical scholar. This guy is not steeped in military history. And, you know, he's as likely to know as much about this as he is to know about General Burt Reynolds' great success at the Battle of Cannonball Run or whatever. I mean, he is trying to reflect, I think, what he thinks people want to hear. And this is sort of, you know, how he's had his political rise, trying to be a mirror to constituencies that he thinks want to hear certain things. I mean, it's abhorrent to us, and it's stupid sounding, but at the same time, you know, it delivered him the presidency once. So I was picking up different things in this statement and was shocked by it, but not surprised, I guess.
Yeah, he's sort of seeing a fissure or maybe a chasm. I don't know how you'd put it over this issue. And he's trying to like cleave it open, right? He's trying to drive a wedge even further in there. And I wonder what you think the effect is, Scott, because, you know, this is something that we see so many Republicans follow suit on.
Well, he's conflating several things that have nothing to do with each other. The idea of the statue removal and Robert E. Lee and the Confederate statues, and then inserting that into our sort of debate over our Afghanistan withdrawal. I mean, these things have nothing to do with each other. He does know that there is a constituency out there that romanticizes Robert E. Lee, that romanticizes the Confederacy. You know, if only we had more troops, if only, you know, we got to have the utopia of the Confederacy. I mean, he knows there's a constituency for that out there, and he knows that people are mad at Biden over Afghanistan. So you take two things that are unrelated and you stick them into the same deal. Humbly, as a political strategy, I would just offer, this ain't it. You know, Joe Biden is really struggling right now. His approval ratings are down. I personally think he's having a disastrous presidency, and it's on the downward swing. But sort of saying, if only we had more Robert E. Lee, it would save us from Joe Biden is not the way to put another Republican in the White House.
Look, can I also just say, how do we know Robert E. Lee, which side he would have been fighting on? Honestly, like, you know, he didn't fight for the United States in the Civil War, so as a matter of historical fact there. Scott, in terms of the Biden presidency right now, the president in the White House has asked a number of Trump appointees who sat on military advisory boards to the military academies to step down or they would be removed. We have the faces up there. They include political figures like Kellyanne Conway and Sean Spicer and David Urban, but also former generals like H.R. McMaster and Jack Keane. As of last night, I think they were removed from these boards if they did not resign. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I thought it was petty, frankly, by Joe Biden to do this. You know, these boards of visitors for these military academies are pretty plum political appointments that presidents often hand out to people who didn't quite make it to the rank of ambassador. I did personnel for George W. Bush, and folks who didn't become ambassadors or cabinet secretaries oftentimes would find their way onto these boards of visitors. So these are really good appointments, often go to a president's biggest political supporters. It's not unusual for a president to put people like this on here. Some of these folks are highly qualified to be on it, and they have terms. And then when those terms go out, the next president puts their people on. They're not part of setting policy for the federal government. I thought it was extremely petty. And frankly, I think what Joe Biden is guaranteed is that when the next Republican comes in, whenever that is, 24 or the next time, whenever, that whatever Democratic appointments were made on the way out, they're going to get wiped away. And I think this is sort of a stupid, tit for tat that we're going to get in here about trying to wipe away the previous president's appointments on boards like this. Certainly, political appointments that manage the federal government, different story. That's not what these are. So I thought it was a really petty, frankly, move by the Biden White House.
Can I ask you, Scott, should he have maybe distinguished between some of these appointments? I mean, you look at, for instance, retired Colonel McGregor, who is a fan of replacement theory, has, railed against women in the military in certain roles. One of the Heidi Stirrup, she pressured DOJ officials to give the Trump White House information about election fraud. I mean, there's different categories of people here. Should the Biden administration have been maybe just more selective about who they were looking at? I mean, do you think those people really belong on a board of visitors? These are folks that I would posit any other Republican wouldn't have appointed.
Yeah, look, I didn't come prepared to debate the merits of each individual appointee to these things. I'm just telling you, it is not normal for a new president to wipe away the appointments of these boards of visitors and other similar kinds of boards and commissions. It is normal to replace political appointees in the operations of the federal government. Totally normal, happens all the time. It does violate our norms for Biden to do what he did here. And would I have chosen all these people? Probably not, but I wasn't the president. And these people get appointed at the pleasure of the president and at the time. And so I would just offer that this is pettiness that is going to perpetuate now because of what Biden has done. Biden sort of ran as a guy who was going to restore our norms and say, look, I'm going to try to get it back to the way we done. We'll have some comedy in Washington. We'll have some bipartisanship. We're not going to be at each other's throat all the time. This action does not match any of that rhetoric. And so I think Democrats are going to regret this move. It was of no consequence, but something that they'll likely regret in the future.
Scott Jennings, thanks for joining us this morning.